it's the public recognition that people think about.
Yeah, I have this funny saying, which is, if you don't fail, you're not risking enough, right? So I'll use that as a cop out there.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I'll be quiet now. Good to see you, Aseem.
Likewise, Kurt. Likewise.
All right, my friend. Well, I think we've got a critical mass, and others will likely continue joining. So, how about we kick off? Because I definitely want to maximize the time that we have with you, Aseem. So, everyone, I'd like to introduce you to Aseem Datar. Aseem and I and Kurt actually work together in various roles and capacities that are, decades plus of time at Microsoft. Aseem most recently exited Microsoft and has joined as a venture partner over at Madrona, arguably the most important venture firm that we have here in the Seattle area. I don't want to spill too much of your background, Aseem, so I'll just refer to you first about introducing yourself, maybe a little bit of your background, and then we'll jump into some Q&A.
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's nice to be here. It's amazing as I reflect on what got me to Seattle. I came here for my master's in electrical engineering over at the U, and then joined Microsoft fresh out of college as an intern. As an intern developer, actually. So I wrote the first piece of code for what became the migration tool over in the client operating system, and then came back the following spring to join them full time as a technical PM, working on this feature that our OEMs use called unattended XML. Basically, it was all about configuring a Windows install in an OEM machine. So if you bought a new piece of hardware, you opened it and Windows didn't install. Partly that was my fault. So that's the feature that I actually worked on as a
Right.
PM. Then spent a few years going really deep on Windows setup. So working on installer level code, setup engines, etc. And then this thing came along, where I had the opportunity to go work on a V1 product. Of course, that never saw light of day, but it was called Digital Locker. Because back in the day, we used to sell CDs and those had licenses on it. And so people would lose the CD and the license is gone. So this was a very simple idea on taking a text string and storing it in what was then the cloud. It was not called the cloud, but on an online account where you'd store the key and then you could go access it. That kind of led us to the path which we now call Office 365, because we thought of it and said, hey, if we're storing licenses, why can't we deliver bits online? And so that was the first instance of Windows and Office where we delivered online. And that was the first time when I was exposed to this thing called Web 2.0 back in or SaaS. It was just called SaaS. And that thing, I literally realized what a hockey stick curve looked like. So we went from zero to, I'd say, a couple $100 million in revenue. Of course, it was a mix shift because people started buying stuff online versus on CDs in 3 months. And that was insane. And I was like, wow, this V1 stuff is awesome. I then did a 3-year stint in the marketing world, ran developer marketing for Windows 7 when it launched. So all the app compat challenges for software and ISVs were part of my remit, and my team did the logo certification program. That's when I got introduced to the wild world of OEM, where Kurt and Jim and I crossed paths, and it carried a sales quota for 3 years after that, running global device sales and running portfolio management for client, office, and services back in the day for Microsoft. And then about 8 years back, bumped into an old manager over in the cafeteria, and he said, what are you doing in sales? Come work on this thing called distributed computing. And I was like, what is that? And joined this thing called Azure, which was going through a reboot. And I joined the team when we were 200 people, I would say roughly about 10 million in revenue, maybe even that. And when I last exited, we were about 25,000 people in engineering, 20 billion run rate. So that was something I would never be able to repeat at Microsoft. I mean, never say never, but and then jumped over into the world of investing, which is something I've always been curious about. So that's kind of my long-winded path.
Excellent. And Kurt and I were chatting about this a month or so ago, but Azure really started as two parallel efforts, right? There was Red Dog, and then there was what is now known as Azure. And Red Dog, I forget what the differences were, but essentially we went on down the Azure route. But you sort of joined in around that time frame, I guess.
Yeah, I think when we did Red Dog, and again, Red Dog was prior to my time, so this is more of me triangulating. So
Yeah.
take it for what it's worth. So Red Dog, I believe, was the whole idea of Red Dog was PaaS first.
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say that we were a little ahead of the market. The market wasn't ready for PaaS.
Right.
And so I think when I joined, we realized that we needed to go IaaS, and Amazon already had a head start, right? They had a 8 year or 6 year head start, and they were growing like wildfire. And we had very limited IaaS offerings at that time. So I think we started with the notion of, look, in order to go win, we've got to have IaaS and PaaS both. And I remember, Jason and I, the first, I think 3 months or so, we met, I'd say over couple hundred CIOs, CTOs, and I even remember one distinct meeting where we're in another part of the of the northern United States, and one CIO said to us, "Hey, come back when the cloud's real." And I was like, "Wow, like, did I get this right? Did I do? I mean, why did I join cloud again?"
Yeah.
But I think coming from that to like a year and a half after that, we were getting calls and saying, "Hey, I need a cloud strategy." I'm like, "Great, happy to work with you on that one. When do you need it by?" And the answer was always like, "Yesterday. I needed it yesterday." So,
Yep.
so in a year and a half, like the world really caught on, and you can see it even now. Like, I mean, there's so much opportunity in infrastructure. But coming back to that Azure point, I think the part around these parallel efforts coming together was really around making sure that you invested in IaaS and making sure that you invested in open source and the Linux ecosystem. And I mean, I would never have imagined a Microsoft CEO standing with a "I love Linux" sign behind his back.
Yeah.
That happened, and so those are the kind of things that we had to sort of make bets on.
What's quite interesting about your career, Aseem, and one thing I've respected quite a bit is you've really done extremely well in both disciplines of both engineering and business, right? You never really lost touch on either of those camps, irrespective of what sort of role you're playing. And now you've jumped into the investment world. I got to ask, like, how's that jump going for you so far?
Well, early days.
Yeah.
I think the Madrona team is awesome. I've known a lot of the people for a long time. Like Soma's been a long-term friend and mentor. Tim Porter, somebody who I know and deeply respect, and I've also learned a lot by observing Matt and working with him in some way, shape, or form when I was at Microsoft. And so I think it's a great bunch of people. Of course, there's a lot of learning that comes with any new shift,
Yeah.
and I kind of feel a lot like the early Azure days, right? Which is so much opportunity, like so much going on in the ecosystem. And I think Madrona is poised to be right at the front and center of this, having deep history, deep roots in the Northwest ecosystem, as well as, expanding across geographies. So I feel pretty fortunate to be there. Net, I think there's so much energy and appetite and, just a lot of hustle in the founder community. The tools are plenty, and today, like back in the day when I graduated, like there was no concept of VMs. Like you have to have hardware, you have to have capex, you have to have the money to go buy or run any sort of experiment. I mean, today it's all pay as you go model. So that has lowered barriers to entry to start new businesses. And even things like containers, deployments, like hyperscalers, like there is so much there that you can do even with an idea in mind. And so that gets me energized. So net, I'm enjoying it. I'm learning a lot, talking to incredibly amazing founders, folks in the industry like yourselves, and
Yep.
it's just amazing.
So that begs the question then, Aseem, that the cloud business is very much established. It's here to stay. There's, day by day, there's just new functionality and new services being built on. The next frontier, I've always believed, is going to be where the edge is going. The edge is going to be really the portal to crap ton worth of new data that needs to be analyzed and reacted to and made actionable. And then beyond that is quantum. But I'd love to get your perspective on kind of where the industry is going. And while it's still early for you in the Madrona world, it would be really interesting to get your perspectives on how you're kind of thinking through those short-term opportunities and those long-term plays as well.
Yeah. So I think I'll answer it in two parts, as you mentioned. I
Yeah.
think the first one is generally where is the industry going, right? So I think the world of cloud has enabled, a few things, right? One is, like you said, compute's gotten cheaper and a lot more efficient and accessible and
Yeah.
democratized, right? So I think you can go run your workloads in the cloud. But more importantly, I think the applications of this are also starting to be more distributed, right? Where AKA the edge. And why is that happening? I think for two main reasons. One is, as you all know, compute even at the edge is getting cheaper, and Moore's law is kick in, where just device and silicon and all these things are getting better, faster, cheaper. And so at the edge, you are able to make like these sort of devices just hardware accelerated endpoints. So that's number one. And then I think the second thing is, if you look at networks, like who would have imagined like bandwidth at the edge getting so accessible and so fast that you can actually pretty much go do anything, right? And with 5G, it's just going to get better. I mean, there is incredible amount of penetration today with both SD-WAN as well as the G spectrum, as I call it.
Yeah.
And if you look at areas where people didn't have network, like if you look at the world, and I want to expand the lens beyond the US, if you looked at tier 2, tier 3 cities, let's say in India, it was hard to get network out there, but there's a smartphone in everybody's hand, and how powerful is that, right? So all these scenarios are lighting up with the edge. I think of these devices are going to be edge devices at some point in time, right? Where what they're doing is they're collecting data at the endpoint. They're sending it back to the cloud at God speed. The cloud's computing. There's probably AI ML running on the cloud itself, and you're doing command and control at the edge. In some cases, you might actually have a chip on it, and you're doing maybe some level of AI and ML at the edge itself, and you don't go back to the cloud. There's a lot of applications of these kind of things in wide variety of industries. Like if you think about mining, if you think about retail, if you think about like autonomous, I think those are fantastic examples of how the edge is lighting up. And I think we're just scratching the surface on what we can do in this world of like these ubiquitous devices, as I call it.
Right. That's really interesting. So, as you know, Goog sits on our advisory board, and Kurt and I and Googs had a chat. Gosh, it was like 2 Christmases ago, I think it was, Kurt. And this was pre Microsoft really making a push with Azure for operators. This was all
Yeah.
pre that. And the conversation with Googs was, in the 5G era, there was two tipping points, right? There was the tipping point of economics, where just by de facto, the architecture for 5G going cloud native, most carriers are moving sort of their services, monolithic like systems, into cloud native, and some of them really embraced it, like a Rakuten or a Dish or a Reliance Jio, and others were kind of getting their arms wrapped around it. So there was a role there for Microsoft to kind of help on the economic side. The other piece of it was really the edge too, because rightly so, and we've heard from Uli Homan speaking about this. We've heard from Sean Hackle speaking about this as well. There's so much that is at play on the edge that we haven't yet realized that is coming, that is driven by industry, and that's really where when you bring that capability closest to where industry is, that's where really we think this huge opportunity in 5G is going to certainly light up.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
I think Kurt wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say another point before you enter is this economic point, I think, is such a critical one, Aseem, because look, at the end of the day, we haven't even scratched the surface about the amount of data that can be created, right? Yeah, sensors are proliferating all over the place, but we're seeing applications out there that could be run at the edge that are collecting, multiple terabytes of data, right? And, whether it's an ag thing and LiDAR based, there's so many things that if the economic models don't work for how that data gets transmitted, where it gets computed, how it gets computed back across, I'll say the data transmission continuum, right? So whether it's computed at the edge, the backhaul, all those kinds of things, I think one of the keys is not only the technology to unlock the opportunity at the edge, but it is the economic models that we have to figure out, because there are lots of scenarios where it just doesn't make sense because the value creation isn't high enough to pay for all the cloud services, right? So you've got to push some of those capabilities further and further to the edge to unlock some of the opportunities. And I think it's both tech and the economic models that need to be worked on. And I think Jim was hitting on that point.
Yeah, I always think of like what examples fit that definition and fit that bill, right? I think the simplest one in my mind is around like smart consumer devices to a certain extent, right? Like take for example my shower head that's dispensing water, right? My shower head doesn't need to tell me every minute that, hey, I'm fine, and that can stop at the field gateway level. I don't need that data on the cloud. But what I do need is probably T minus, let's say 30 days of when it fails, or T plus 30 days on how it's performing. That's the critical piece of what would be helpful for an ML algorithm, saying, hey, what's the early indicator that I can sort of learn from to be predictable about it? Maybe the water flow reduces, maybe it gets too hot, and I'm not an expert on that. But I think those are the kind of things that would warrant going into the ML algorithm from what's the critical piece of data. When you're fine, I don't need that data. It's almost like a ping saying, I'm fine, I'm fine. Like it's the whole Nyquist theorem, right?
I think that's right. And it's like those scenarios to me that there's edge intelligence and there's
Yeah.
cloud intelligence, right? And I think that is how we have to figure out this also data continuum, right? Where is the right place to be computing on what set of data?
Yeah, but to contrast it, if I mean a smart meter outside my house that tells me more about like energy consumption or water consumption, I mean that data is critical because now my billing scenario is getting even better. I mean when Nest came around and I installed the Nest in my house, I had no idea how my heat performance is relative to my neighbors, but now I have that intelligence. I'm like, oh, maybe I should adjust something. Maybe I'm paying more than somebody else is, and I think those are relevant pieces of data that were pretty much missing from our consideration set. And again, I think in talking to Alan from Symmetric, as I was learning about what they're doing, I think that's a great use case for them as they're thinking about like, hey, across the G spectrum, there is going to be a proliferation of 2G, 3G, 4G, even as 5G lights up. And could I put a cheaper SIM card in those smart meters? Absolutely. And now I make them intelligent devices.
Yeah. So when we caught up for coffee 2 weeks back, you had shared that your role in Madrona is to really kind of think through the service provider space, the impact of 5G, where the investment opportunities are, how that correlates to where enterprise is going, the edge. Like there's this big ball of opportunity that you're kind of sifting through. Again, I know you're kind of early in this journey, but I'd love to get some top of mind ideas that you're kind of still intrigued about or questioning and looking into from an investment perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is where a little bit of the spectrum is way too broad, but I'm indexing it on what we at Madrona call as intelligent applications for the enterprise, right? So
Yeah.
I think if you think of it like what makes an intelligent application, uh, I think something that's able to command and control, drive predictive, capabilities, corrective actions, insights into data, inferences from data, as well as like getting you to the right point of intuition. Like those are all examples of things what would make an intelligent application. And I know the term is fairly broad, but the
Yeah.
way I look at it is I'm going from IaaS all the way to SaaS. And so I think, I have the fortune of sort of working in the cloud industry. So understanding, IaaS all the way to like the SaaS kind of spectrum from an infrastructure level.
Right.
But now I think there's these applications getting built on top of that in the cloud space. And I think that's one. But if I think of cloud, I actually think of cloud and edge. I just don't think of cloud only because even at the edge is going to light up because of investments we're making or Microsoft or Amazon or Google is made on the cloud. And so if you look at edge devices coupled with, the network layer on top of that, like that's sort of my playing field. Robotics is another sort of area which gets me very excited. And coming back to that point of why those things, why now? It's all because these scenarios are lighting up, and we couldn't have done that. I mean, 5 years ago. I mean, if you think of it, robotics was always this intriguing thing, right? Like I remember being in India as a child and watching Small Wonder, and I'm like, wow, that's a robot. Today, you can imagine that being built because the tech is there. I think the question is, how do you narrow down on the application space? I mean, there are smart arms. I mean, TerraClear is one of Madrona's investments, and TerraClear over in Bellevue is actually building smart excavators. I mean, or rock pickers. How cool is that? Like in the agri space. I mean, Microsoft has always talked about the investments they're making in agriculture, but again, all these things are possible because you've got network and you've got compute at the edge. Drones, autonomous, like pick anything. Like you can't do that if you don't have a strong backbone of a network that's low latency, high bandwidth, and being able to drive corrective action. Like MLAI is the other space that I'm very intrigued about. For two reasons, and this point sort of landed in my head when I first started working in the cloud space, and this question popped up in the early days of AI, like, so how do we know what's difference between a dog and a cat? I mean, both have similar characteristics: two eyes, one nose, whiskers, ears. And so how do humans figure that out? We figure that out by training, by lots and lots of data points as we grow up. But if I were to explain that to my child, like what's a dog, what's a cat, like there's no algorithm. I just have to show her a whole bunch of these things and she'll learn. So it's about proliferation of that data. It's about training and it's about deploying that model at the edge.
Right. Just to go off script for a second here, you touched on something that's really interesting because about a year and a half ago, I was invited in by Len to meet with Tim and Holly, and we were in the boardroom there at Madrona, and we were just chatting
Oh,
about sort of 5G, right? What it
yeah.
was, and my goal that morning was to say, look, this isn't if you focus on 5G as a carrier CSP play, you're actually missing this broader point, and you're touching on all of those points that I was trying to make. And so, is it safe to assume that as investors, when you're looking at this 5G market, really the thinking is evolving past this just being a carrier play, right? Because they are an important value part in this. But there's edge, there's AI, there's ML, there's all the other fun stuff that you just mentioned is really part of that broader opportunity.
Yeah, and the way I tend to think of it as any tech investment or infrastructure investment, like the question you have to ask yourself is that is being made to what end? Like what's the end goal of that investment that carriers are making or hyperscalers are making or any technology company is making? I mean, what's the end goal?
Yeah.
And I think with 5G, in my mind, the end goal is pretty clear. Low latency, high bandwidth, always connected,
Yep.
not limiting in terms of access and penetration across the geography. And so I think if you think of those things and you bring it together, like that benefits a whole host of scenarios.
Agreed.
Uh, and that is the broader question on to what end. Now there is always going to be that overarching question of like, so what's the adoption curve like? How quickly is the market moving and accepting, and how quickly is the market deploying, right? And Jim, you know this better than anybody else, but it's the conundrum of a new technology and developers, right? Like you've got developers or ISVs building applications, and you got new technology, but you need developers. And if you see developers, that thing's going to get better, right?
Yep.
So it's a flywheel, and shameless plug for Tom Alberg's book that just came out in Flywheels, but it's a great read. Like he literally nails this concept on. And by the way, for those who don't know, Tom's our founder at Madrona, and he's a very, very popular, well-known, influential figure over at Madrona, and always someone that I have deep respect for. But coming back to that flywheel, you really need to break that flywheel. And you've got to have an injection into the tech has to be so great that developers won't miss that boat. And because there's so many applications being written, the tech only starts to get better and light up more. So
Yeah.
5G is no different in my mind.
I totally agree. Built the program specifically to get to get after that. So yeah, well said. Going back to your days at Microsoft for just a moment, and obviously nothing confidential here, but when I had a chance to work with Jason, long past you started with him. If you remember, we took him down to San Francisco.
Yeah.
He met with a bunch of startups, and at the time it was, if you remember, he took like a 6-month break from releasing new features because it was all about stability and systems and all that fun stuff, right? Because Azure had been built so quickly that it was necessary to take a break on releasing new features and really stabilize the system before growing again. And a lot has positively happened since that time. I'm curious to get your perspective on what are some of the bigger moves that the cloud vendors generally are spending their time thinking about for the next 5-year horizon. Obviously, Edge is probably in that world. I'm seeing a lot of dabbling in quantum, and there's some work happening there. But I'm curious to get your insider's perspective again, without breaking into confidentiality, of what are sort of the big rocks of opportunity that they're looking at.
Yeah, I'll answer that slightly differently from a non-Microsoft perspective, and
Sure.
just outline what the hyperscalers lens really is. I think there is still a big land grab going on, right? Because if you think of it, I mean, the world IT spend probably only like maybe the last I saw, maybe like 15% of it is going to the cloud, and there's still like 85% more opportunity. So the question really becomes is like, how does a hyperscaler like help customers transform quickly, like things like migration of like
Yeah.
critical workloads? Like, so it's a little bit of like start small, get some projects successful, build some confidence, and then move the other more critical workload into the cloud. And not that the critical workloads are now not into cloud. I mean, SAP on Azure is a great example, right? These are critical workloads. Like your close as an enterprise won't happen if you don't get this right. So I think there is a critical workloads already on the cloud, but how do you accelerate that? How do you get organizations comfortable with the fact that the clouds are enterprise ready, and they are. The second thing is really around like, how do you get talent across the world to embrace and bet on these new technologies without actually being worried about things like uptime, fundamentals, provisioning, billing, commerce, etc. So a lot of infrastructure is still at play that needs to get better. And then the third, from a customer standpoint, is how is your cloud actually helping, vertical or different verticals? And operative
Yeah.
is a great example, right? How is the cloud helping carriers? From an IoT standpoint, how are IoT services over in Azure helping IoT projects succeed? And so I think having deeper insight into those verticals and building the cloud so that it serves those verticals is an important step. Um, I'm not implying that the hyperscalers get into verticals. I mean, you're always going to need partners and ISVs who are deep into those verticals and who understand those problems end to end and can deliver end to end solutions. I mean, look, the way I look at it is the platform gets thicker,
Yeah.
and your solutions start to get deeper on top of it, right? So there's always that play. And people get worried about, oh, our hyperscaler is going to come into my domain. And, I think outside of one hyperscaler, I wouldn't worry about it, sort of going into different verticals. But mostly, I think getting it right across the gamut is important.
Yeah.
Then there is the question about, like, how do you innovate and build for new things like edge, where there are going to be these truly distributed mechanisms at play from a tech standpoint, right?
Yeah.
Imagine a mine, right? They are probably going to need let's say a monolithic device as you're going deeper and deeper into the Earth's crust, like where maybe the network doesn't cut it. Maybe private 5G has a role to play there, right? Like
Yeah.
how do you kind of light those scenarios up? And on top of that, how do you build for hybrid scenarios where people want, for sovereign reasons, some data or workloads on their premise and burst into the cloud?
Right.
So I think those things are still a lot of the things that are top of mind for hyperscalers, and they'll continue to build on those lines.
Interesting. Okay. So when I'd love to get your opinion. I know we had our coffee a couple of weeks ago, and we kind of talked about the various components in that 5G stack, right? From the radios to the core, to the edge of the cloud and all that fun stuff. And you mentioned intelligent applications as something that Madrona is really, very much thinking about. But there's a ton of disruption that's happening just in the carrier side. I mean, Microsoft's $2 billion bet with Affirmed and Metaswitch is probably the best indication of, potential disruption that's happening there. And again, 3 weeks into investing here, but do you see the venture community really looking, like taking another look at where 5G technology is going, perhaps at the radio level and some other areas differently? And I'm asking that because, I've talked to hundreds of investors in my time frame, and most of them, I would say 85 to 90% of them, shy away from anything telco because they really didn't see telcos being super innovative or those bets not really paying off well. But now that the game has changed, the rules have changed as well. And so I'm curious to get your perspective as it's forming around this area.
Yeah, I mean, look, I tend to approach it from the perspective of, like, that's infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
And infrastructure is essential component of the entire value chain. You don't have that, you don't have an edge,
Right.
right? And same goes with Wi-Fi, and same goes with the G spectrum. And I think the way I look at it is, I think 5G is an accelerant for sure. It's going to light up scenarios that aren't possible today. I mean, a drone's not going to work on Wi-Fi flying over a farm. Like, how is that going to be possible?
Yeah.
And so I think there is definitely a role that 5G has to play. I think it's an accelerant. I do think that it's going to provide these scenarios a shot in the arm, and especially as you go deeper and deeper away from the coasts, you've got to have those scenarios covered, and
Yeah.
you can't only focus on certain areas. I mean, gaming is another place, right? Casual gaming, like today we play on our phones. Uh, I'm not a gamer, but I know that some of the hardcore gamers I know, like, worry about latency. Like, how is
Right.
that going to get solved, right?
Right.
I was talking to one of the content providers who put setup boxes into people's houses, and their point of view was, yeah, you've got Wi-Fi. People often change the Wi-Fi password, and if our device is connected to that, that changes, things break, and now we get a support call. Like, what if
Yeah.
we had a SIM? And that's cheaper. The support time call is going to be, not sort of in existence anymore. I can manage the device remotely. I can wipe the device remotely. I can stream it remotely, and I can self-manage it end to end. I don't need to have a professional services arm. And so I think those things are, again, coming back to that question of to what end. So
Yep.
5G is the means to the end, and that end is connectivity, edge at scale, and manageability at scale.
Right. Okay, so let me switch gears here for a moment and once again go off script for a second, because as you can appreciate in the startup world, there's essentially two paths that most founders want to pursue. The first path, and it's always success based, but the first path is build something so great that perhaps someone bigger than them acquires and integrates the product or service into a larger portfolio, or IPO. That's obviously the holy grail. And when we worked together at Microsoft, there was always a lot of inbound interest, right? Want to collaborate with all lines of Microsoft products, Azure or Windows Server and such. But from given where you sat with Jason, right, at the senior level, how, in your opinion, how did founders really punch above the fray and actually get really noticed? And what advice would you give to founders who are trying to plug in not just to inside a Microsoft ecosystem, but a broader set of ecosystems? Because there is a lot of noise in the generally in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I have a pretty simple framework on how I would think of it. I would think of it as really like three levers, or there might be a fourth one, and it'll come to me. I think the first lever is, market expansion. Like, are you helping a company like Microsoft or Amazon or Google, for that matter, achieve
Yeah.
market expansion? Right. So are you going in and creating net new markets, net new scenarios, net new customers
Got it.
for them? The second one is more around uh, market expansion, but within your existing customer base. So are you lighting up net new scenarios that your customers can do and take advantage of your platforms in an accelerated manner? And people can term it as upsell, cross-sell, whatnot, but that's kind of the general genesis of, like, within the customer, are you helping the customers achieve or create more value, right? Instead of just value shift.
Yeah.
And the third thing is more around, like, are you going in and tackling white spaces from a technological standpoint, which is going to leapfrog somebody like Microsoft ahead of its competitors and create a long-term competitive moat.
Yeah.
I think those are the three big buckets, and it's not rocket science. I think all the founders kind of have that index, but I think there's a really important fourth one, which is to a certain extent customer satisfaction, customer love, delight, and maybe even optimization around their existing estate, right? And that's a very interesting one in the world of cloud, because sometimes, and I've seen this with many customers, they're deploying the cloud, but they're probably not taking full advantage of it. So what does it mean to get there faster? What does it mean to get there more efficient? What does it mean to optimize for margin? And you'll see a lot of players kind of work their way up towards a customer and saying, look, we know you spend a bunch of cloud, but let me help you make it more efficient. Let me help you get the most value out of it. It's almost like saying, look, let me help you depreciate your hardware faster in the olden world. And
Yeah.
that's value as well.
Yeah.
So I think those are the four big categories under which I would sort of typify. And if you think of, like, as we called it, a cheap version of an MBA framework, like, what makes a great business? Like, you've got revenue growth, you've got cost optimization, you've got a long-term competitive mode, which is grabbing share, and the fourth one is a happy team. And so I think if you look at the first three and you index on that, saying, hey, am I creating value for Microsoft in the first three domains? Then I think you're onto something there.
Awesome. Awesome. Um, I asked this question of all of our speakers, partners, and industry speakers as well. I'm curious to get your perspective on private wireless. Clearly, Microsoft is dabbling with that. I think Metaswitch is the key offering there, among other stuff. But I'm curious to see your opinion on private wireless, whether it's private 5G, private 4G LTE today to private 5G in the future. Do you see this as a sort of a market that's building momentum in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one, right? And the reason why I'll say this, and again, I have not, I mean, nothing under the course of NDA here,
Yep.
but I look at it from a slightly broader lens, and again, coming from the other angle of, like, why would I ever want it, right? And there's scenarios for which I want it, which is, again, security being one of them. To sort of a contained way of high quality network in my premise, I would say. And this is more true of, like, factories, industries, like manufacturing plants, I think there are very many scenarios that could actually benefit from the use of like private 5G, private networks, as well as like device management. I think that's a big one, right? Today in the world of like bring your own device into a lot of the enterprises, like how do you control those things of a public network? I mean, if a public network gets attacked and compromised, like all your users are compromised along with their data, along with their actions and activities, and that's a big risk.
Yeah.
uh, Private network might actually give IT a single pane of glass, a systematic way of managing all their endpoints that are deployed in the enterprise, and again within certain geographic limits or whatnot. But it probably provides you more intelligence on your devices, on your users, and more manageability, which today is very federated. So if you're looking at bringing all these things together, either through a single pane of glass or either through a single common management framework, and have a control plane that sits on top and manages everything, there's value there.
Yeah, I totally agree. And this kind of reminds me of, I guess it was maybe 10 years ago, see, remember when we did branch networking or branch, and we actually launched it as a feature in Windows Server, I think it was 2008 at the time. It kind of reminds me like we've come around again, where the spectrum gets replaced from Wi-Fi to cellular, and the hardware gets replaced from Windows Server to like an Azure Stack Edge or some sort of a managed box that then plugs into a set of cloud-based services that provides all that capability that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
It's sort of like grown up. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if I'm thinking about it quite right, or if I have my head wrapped around it, in the most organized manner. But
Yeah.
I tend to think of like there's certain spaces in the spectrum that today get time sliced and reserved, right? This is no different, but for the enterprise at a deeper
Yeah.
level. So you've got a slice of it that's reserved for you that you can manage, control, deploy, do whatever with it in a highly curated environment that is just for you.
Agreed. So let's talk a little bit about Madrona. So Madrona is arguably, one of the more influential, and long-standing adventure firms here in the Seattle area. It's kind of akin to our Sequoia, very influential, and it's a life cycle investor, right? It invests right from the early stage, and it does follow-ons as well. Your funds have done, but from where you're at today, what do you think what is the sweet spot for Madrona, in terms of how it looks at investments in teams? Because it has invested across all stages.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, we pride ourselves on being what we call as day one for the long run,
Yeah.
right? So we're working super early with the founders, even on an idea, ideating, trying to find white space, get to a product market fit, cross that fit, get sort of some customer validations, get really usage up and going, and then refine, and keep working with them to go create and deliver incremental value. And we've also made some, not so early investments, which have also played out well. And I think that's again our thesis again continues to evolve, but the core DNA is day one for the long run. And so I mean, in fact, I could tell you, Jim, I can't even count on my fingers the number of meetings I've already had in the first 3 weeks to sort of sit down with founders, like hear their idea, hear their pitch, and oftentimes it might just be a problem identifying stage in the market.
Yeah.
I made my first investment in week 1.5. I would say I bet on this company called Spice AI, which is actually founded by an ex-Azure guy, Luke. Luke and I used to sit across each other, and Luke solving this problem for developers and helping AI accessible for them in ways that will help improve workflow and get applications faster to market. And again, this was seed investment, super early, but they've got great traction and great ideas around what they want to go do. So it's pretty exciting to sort of work with someone at the grassroots level and go from that into building a big successful company.
Agreed. Agreed. Kurt, did you want to say something?
I was just gonna say I wasn't aware that Madrona was investing in companies at those stages, right? So that's really interesting to hear, Aseem, and so love it and great to hear it. I just wasn't aware of that piece of what you guys are working on. I don't know if that's something you're specifically working on or if that's been a track record, but love to hear that. So I think that's
Yeah,
great.
no, I think we've always like done, the day one for the long run kind of investments. I mean, if you look at like Read.ai is another one that we're looking at, and that's indexed on like how do you drive intelligence in video calls, and how do you give people real-time feedback to adjust to make sure that there's deeper engagement. I mean, we've done a lot of these early investments, and it's awesome to sort of sit alongside founders and work with them on, deep problems that they see in the industry. Might not have a solution then, but the whole point is to really sit shoulder to shoulder, be a part of the team. And that's where I think personally I have the most fun, right? To kind of get in there. And Azure taught me that, where you're sort of grinding away, and Satya has this amazing term around growth hacking, and it is indeed growth hacking, right? You don't know what problem you're going to hit, and you hit the problem, you're like, oh shit, dead end, like go the other way. And then you keep maneuvering around it, and the best ones, in my opinion, are the ones who smile and say, oh, that was dumb, like let's go the other way. And it's a little bit of a mindset shift that I've enjoyed over a period of years, and just learned at Microsoft.
Yeah. What I love about it though is and it's to a point you were making earlier, right? Even about the cloud market and where it's at in its development. And I always talk about this being somewhere between 10 and 20%, depending upon which analyst you say, has actually moved over there. Even that market is still in early stages, right? It's not a mature market, and it's been around for a dozen years, if not more. And I always say that, as you said, it's very dependent upon what infrastructure gets deployed in what scenarios that unlock a lot of those opportunities. And so this 5G and edge thing is still so nascent and so early, right? That I love the fact that you guys are in that exploratory stage and mentality as well, looking for the right bets for something that quite honestly is still in its infancy in terms of developing.
Yeah. I mean, every device, right? Like I don't know where I was reading it, but looks like 2025 is going to have like some 75 billion connected devices as an example. And then 75% of those are going to have some sort of G connectivity in it. Like it's just amazing, like how much opportunity is out there, right? And recently I heard Bob Muglia talk about like just data. Like there is so much data, and there's structured, there's unstructured. Now you're connecting it to a data lake, then you're running algorithms, then you're cleansing the data, then you're training your models, you're deploying your models, you're learning it, and you're doing the whole process again. And by the way, while you're doing it, there's more data coming in that's more richer.
Yeah.
And so it's this again, like goes back to this flywheel effect of like there's no stopping here.
Yeah. And there's a value creation opportunity at each state of that data pipeline, right? That I think is still left to be explored.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think of a lot of legacy industries today, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit if you just look at it, right? Like manufacturing, industrial, like factory lines, cars, sensors, smart meters, transportation, healthcare, logistics. Like there's just an endless possibility of the things that can light up.
We're doing a workshop today, Aseem, and then tomorrow we're doing a formal sort of a government-y workshop for Port of Tacoma, and helping them become modern. And it's a struggle almost daily where they're like, so why do we need networks, and what's the value of data? I'm just fine walking around a container with a clipboard and doing my thing. There's a mindset issue here where those legacy industries that you talked about, once they see the advantages for having good real data that can help them both in predictive means, but also in just making their operations more efficient, the world lights up in such a different way.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
And I mean, I don't want to talk about this a whole lot, but I do think that there's so much efficiency that can be even derived with the way we operate today, like let alone operating in a net new world. And I'll give you an example. In my early days at Azure, like came across this use case of an airline that started tracking its fuel consumption, right? And that's the biggest cost. And turns out that if you have the same airline, the same weight profile, the same runway, everything normalized, but the only difference is in the person who's flying it, like depending upon the pilot, like he or she, and their background. So if the pilot was a commercially trained pilot, they would go slow, and they would go slow off the runway, and they would gradually gun it, right? Versus somebody who was more like an ex Air Force person would gun it right at the gate, and that caused more fuel consumption. And so if you compared those two, like if you just adjusted and provided training and guardrails on like, hey, go slow to begin with, like that fuel consumption just save them like millions of dollars. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing, right? And you didn't track fuel, you didn't track patterns, you would never know this.
Yeah, well, let alone the opportunity to maybe automate that process.
That's
right.
That's right. I mean,
Exactly.
And the point is like, even if you don't automate, but you just sort of provide them a little bit more training, I think you can get so much further. But totally, Kurt, your point is like bang on.
Yeah.
You know,
Good.
yesterday Carl was sharing that they did a project with Target, right? 1,800 stores across the country. And as you know, Acuity does lighting systems and automation and such. And so they just completed, not just, but a little while ago, completed a project that updated and automated the dimming of these lights across 1,800 stores. And that project alone has saved, or is projected to save Target $4 million. Just the efficient use of lighting and in their various stores will save them on average $4 million a year, which is probably worth multiples more than whatever cash outlay was put up by Target to outfit their stores with these systems. And that's that access to data that's so fundamentally different, that many organizations are really starting to wake up to. And one topic that we've had consistently on these calls, and it started with our friends over at Avanade. They came in, and we've been interviewing or having Avanade on our calls since the beginning of our batches. And the first one was right when COVID started to hit, right? And you probably saw this at Microsoft. A lot of enterprises were essentially locked out of their manufacturing. We're starting to suffer early day supply chain disruptions, all of these things. And they had no resiliency in their IT fabric, none. Right? They had no ways to deliver on products or services where humans were involved, and those humans weren't able to get to their place of work. And over the summer last year, a lot of those same enterprises started really taking this as an opportunity, starting building a lot more resiliency. So COVID has been detrimental worldwide, but has actually forced a lot of industries to look at data and automation and access to that insight as a resilient part of their operation, so they don't let another COVID or other disruption hold them back like they have today.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like think of even like the information worker, right? Like remote desktop, like that's huge. I mean,
Yeah.
Jim, how long have we been shipping remote desktop at Microsoft? Like,
My God, yeah.
well, I think, and again, I don't have any data, but now if you look at it, I would bet my 20 that it's kind of gone like that,
Yeah.
right? Because virtual desktops are a thing, right?
Yeah.
I was just, and I don't know where I saw this, but I saw a small video where somebody was teaching younger kids to do Windows D, which is like create another desktop. I'm like, wow, like I mean, how cool is that, right? Things like Teams. And you know, pre-COVID, we had a lot of people who would dial in, and audio was never fine, and video never worked. And you hear Satya say that the cloud world of Microsoft has gone and probably achieved what we would have otherwise achieved in 5 more years.
Yeah.
We've achieved in 1 year. So the markets kind of moved so much faster, and again, cloud is just one component of that, right?
Agreed. Hey, Stuart, do you have a question, my friend?
I did. Hey, Aseem, Stuart McGrath from Section.
Hi, Stuart.
I was interested in your story. You mentioned the story of your entrance into Azure, the cafe story, where one of your colleagues said to you something to the effect of, "Hey, do you want to come and work on distributed computing?" It seems to me that the ability to run applications across a distributed fabric are essential to the edge story. I'm interested in your thoughts as to whether you think that in the cloud world, distributed computing has been worked on, or is it that cloud has gone to a point of multiple centralized locations, and will cloud get to a full distributed pattern?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. The way I would sort of try to rationalize it in my head, Stuart, and again, this might not be the right way, but I think we started with the world where we were, big device first, right? Like all our experiences were on, like, let's say a desktop or a laptop, and I think we started with like, server first, client first, right? Then we moved into the world where mobile phones took off, and we went into a mobile first and a cloud first kind of opportunity where distributed computing, at least on the client server world, sort of started to take off, and the cloud started to take off. And I think now we're looking at this in this place where we're probably going to go invest in edge first, right? Like what are the edge first applications, and how do they move seamlessly in terms of experiences across different device types? But I actually think that where the world will go is it'll be form factor first, right? Meaning that the app is optimized for the edge, the app is optimized for your phone, the app is optimized for the cloud. And I think these experiences move seamlessly irrespective of the device, because at the end of the day, the device is just an endpoint, right? It's the way you consume the app and the experience. And so the moment the device doesn't become the front and center of everything. It's actually the experience. And so I don't know if that's the right way to think about it or not, but that's how I feel that the true vision of distributed computing will come to life, where irrespective of device, you have a killer experience.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. One of the things I think, Stuart, on this point, it's interesting, is one of the necessary steps to get to distributed computing is some consolidation of compute, right? And if all this stuff was in individual data centers run by every company around the world, right, the world of the past IT before the cloud happened, it would be very hard to get to a consistent model that allowed for, quite honestly, distributed computing as we might envision it at the far edges. So sometimes consolidation and integration is required to get to distributed computing. We saw this with the web as well.
Yeah,
I would add,
perhaps.
Yeah, I would add one other thing, which is there's been varied views, right? That, like, one of the views that I know I had heard was, hey, these devices, like, why do they need compute? They're just a screen, right? It's just a screen. So as long as you have screen with great battery power, you should be good, right? And it should be able to transact fine. Why do you need to have compute on that? But as we talked about, there are probably scenarios where the chip on that thing needs to spin and needs to make some decisions that are local to the experience that the device offers. Doesn't need to make a round trip to the cloud, doesn't need to make a round trip to the client. So I think endpoints are going to exist. There is going to be smartness in the endpoints and connectivity. And I think those are the two things. So compute, some level of storage, and high bandwidth. I think those are the characteristics that I would say would make distributed computing purely, I would say, a killer experience across any device type.
As we're getting close to the end of the call, Aseem, and again, thank you. This has been a great discussion. Madrona is based here in the Pacific Northwest, and I think initially, this was years ago, your focus was really investing in Pacific Northwest founders in their teams. But correct me if I'm wrong, you're really looking at deal flow, across the U.S. too, and maybe even internationally. But please correct me if I'm wrong on kind of your scope or geography scope.
Yeah, I mean, look, like I said, I think the big theory for us is day one for the long run, right? And we really like to roll up our sleeves and work with founders pretty closely. The world is changing, right? And I think we're also sort of taking a hard look at, like, what does that mean? Yeah, we make investments globally as well. But we want to make sure that we are the right investor and we provide incremental value that's more important for the founders, right? So, and in the world of today, where virtual is a possibility and everybody works remote, and there's a lot of remote companies, like, we're evolving too. And so I think we've opened ourselves up to say, look, we will be able to use these new paradigm shifts and contribute to the world in meaningful ways and to founders in meaningful ways. So we want to be doing both. Now, of course, and again, this is my opinion on Madrona's, but I would say that there's definite value in being face to face, and there's definitely, like, a different level of elevation that happens when people see each other in flesh and blood. But at the same point of time, we're looking everywhere.
Okay. Well, on that note, if some of the founders here were interested in following up and maybe having a chat with you, would you be okay for doing that?
Pre-seed, yes. Seed, yes. Like, everything's fair game. So please don't hesitate to reach out. I am aseem@madrona.com, and Jim and Kurt both know where to find me in case you're having trouble. But
Absolutely.
yeah, would love to chat, and would love to know all the excitement that's going around in this cohort.
Thank you, Aseem. So, guys, I think but we had a session scheduled that unfortunately had to be postponed. It was with Dell. They had a conflict, and I called Aseem or emailed Aseem on Tuesday and said, "Hey, man, I know this is short notice, but would you be open to doing this?" And of course, he jumped on it within minutes. So, Aseem, I know you're a busy individual, but I really, really appreciate you spending some time with us today and having a really cool conversation. Kind of sharing your perspectives on where the cloud is, and now that you're transitioning on the investor world, some of that as well. So, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Thank you, Kurt, for having me. I think it's incredible. Like, I'd love to, like, sit down and learn more from you guys as time progresses on what you're seeing and what the patterns are.
Let's get a regular lunch scheduled every other month or something, Aseem, just to keep catching up. And do me a favor, please say hi to Soma on Jim and I's behalf. I miss him. He's a great person.
And obviously, we'd love to have you here at our open house on December 8th, my friend. We'll have Googs, not Googs, actually, he's out of town, but some other folks here. So I'd love to have you here for that, and our teams. Awesome. Well, thank you, my friend. Have a good rest of your day.
Enjoy the rest of the day. Talk to you soon.
Yes, stay dry. Cheers. Bye.